because I think we were spending a disproportionate amount of our resource on ourselves. But I think we also needed to right size the organization mentally so we weren't behaving as though we were the center of the universe. And I think kind of getting us to kind of understand that we are one node in a civil society ecosystem rather than the hub, I think is was a kind of important shift.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Bloem, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Okay, good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who will introduce himself. Patrick, please go ahead.
Maurice, thank you. I'm Patrick Watt, and I'm the chief executive of Christian Aid, which is the development and humanitarian agency of the British and Irish churches. I'm based in London, so I'm joining this conversation today from our office just near Waterloo Station. For those of you who know London, I live in Oxford, which is about 55 miles from London, so I commute in
Okay.
on the train.
Uh-huh. And so where you live now, were you born there as well? And
So
if
no, I
not,
was
where were you born and raised? Yeah.
no, I was born in the east of England,
Okay.
in a fairly flat agricultural part of the country, a county called Lincolnshire. And my father actually worked in farming, and so I grew up in a village, part of a big family, one of 6 children, and then went away to university at the age of 18. First of all to Cambridge, and then to London, and then wound up in Oxford, partly because, well, mainly because my, I suppose my first proper job uh, out of university was at Oxfam. And as many people know, Oxfam's name derives from the Oxford Committee for Famine Relief. So
Mm-hmm.
Oxfam to this day, the main office is still in Oxford. So I wound up there and then put down roots there. And although I've kind of worked most of my working life in London and a short spell in Washington, D.C., I've kind of kept the home in Oxford. And that's where my children grew up.
Okay. And no, thanks for that, Patrick. And can we go back to, you said you were part of family of 6, right? Is
Yeah.
that correct? And were you the youngest, the eldest, and how was that to,
Yeah.
um, yeah, was it a village more? Was it urban? What
Yeah,
did
it
you
was a
do?
village, fairly small village, so it was
Mm-hmm.
kind of proper rural upbringing. I went to a secondary school in the nearest city, which is a
Mm-hmm.
place called Lincoln. But yeah, grew up in a smallish village. Um, I'm what would now be called a blended family. From a blended family, I didn't know that's what they were called when I was growing
Okay.
up.
Yeah.
But I have 3 older siblings, 2 brothers and a sister who were from my father's first marriage. And then his first wife died actually, and he met my mother and remarried. So I'm both the middle child and the oldest child,
Okay.
depending on how you're viewing these things.
Yeah.
But yeah, kind of big family, and I suppose quite a lot of freedom growing up in a village, quite outdoors. Um, and I guess that's given me a kind of an abiding um, love of being outside, of nature. Um, and I spent, I suppose, a lot of my teenage years and the school holidays working on farms to earn money. So, yeah, I kind of know how to drive a tractor and a trailer, for example.
Okay. Yeah. But that is then, not the direction you went, right? In when you went
No,
to university.
yeah.
But you
So,
you.
I studied my first degree was in theology at
Mm-hmm.
Cambridge,
And
and
why was that? Why did you pick that?
why did I pick theology? Well, I suppose fundamentally I thought it asked really important questions about the world and
Mhm.
what it is to be human. Um, and I thought giving some time over to that was worthwhile. I grew up in a practicing Christian family, so that was very much part of the kind of the weft and weave of daily life. So that probably kind of shaped me to some extent. But I have five other siblings who didn't go off and study theology, so it was probably personal to me as well. Um,
In which direction did they go? All kinds of
well,
direction
very
or
varied. I mean, I have
very
a
varied?
brother
Yeah.
who's a surgeon. I have a brother who's a geologist.
Mm.
Another who's a private businessman. And so on. So yes,
Mm.
I mean, people went into kind of very different walks of
Yeah.
life. Um, and I suppose that studying theology was probably um, quite important for me in terms of both helping to develop my own adult understanding of Christian faith. I mean, some people study theology and it weakens their Christian faith. I think on the whole, it affirmed a lot of what I'd received as a child, but I think it changed it, it matured it. Um, and I guess I was thinking about what kind of larger purpose I wanted to kind of serve with my life. I was interested in working on issues of poverty and social justice. So I guess that came. It sounds a bit cliched, but it came perhaps from a kind of desire to help leave the world a better place than I'd found it. Um, and that led me after the theology degree into studying international development studies in London at LSE. And I guess that was largely kind of economic history and political economy. And that led on to my first role at Oxfam. But yeah, I suppose that was it. That kind of piece about kind of contributing to society, and understanding that there was no kind of human flourishing at the expense of other people. I think that was probably quite rooted in the upbringing I had. Um, I think the life lessons my parents and others around me gave. I suppose I spent quite a lot of time on human rights campaigning at university. I chaired the Amnesty International group at university. I did quite a lot of volunteering down the years for um, organizations working with people who are homeless. Um, and so, yeah, I guess in a number of different ways, I was quite kind of socially and politically engaged.
Mm.
And that uh, I very much always saw as kind of part of what it meant to have an active Christian faith. I certainly didn't see it as distinct from my Christian faith.
No, thanks for that, Patrick. When I was looking at your journey from Oxfam to Action Aid and recently Save the Children as well, right?
Yeah.
I was thinking like, why did it take so long for Patrick to end up with Christian Aid? I mean, looking at your theology background,
Mm,
and
mm.
then yeah.
Yes, it's a good question. In some ways, I've asked that of myself.
Mm-hmm.
I think maybe part of it was that I didn't want to be kind of bracketed as a professional Christian. I didn't mind being a Christian professional, but I didn't want to be seen as somebody who only worked for church-based or kind of faith-inspired organizations. So, I suppose working out there in the wider sector um, felt important from that point of view. But Christian Aid was always an organization that I'd admired and I'd had quite a lot to do with down the years while working for other organizations. So I always saw it as an organization that asked the harder questions about the underlying causes of poverty, was willing to challenge um, organizations with power to tackle those underlying causes. Um, and because of its identity as an interchurch organization, an organization supported by many different church traditions, um, it was an organization I thought that kind of convened well and held difference well. Um, and there was a kind of integrity, I think, to that kind of open, expansive expression of Christian faith that I felt kind of Christian Aid exemplified. So um, coming to Christian Aid felt like a good way of marrying both my personal faith motivation, which led me into this sector in the first place, with that kind of professional experience that I gained, as you say, in Oxfam and Action Aid and Save the Children. So quite a kind of happy marriage, and in that respect, and enabled me, I guess, to kind of integrate what perhaps at certain points in the past had felt a little bit siloed.
Okay. And um, was that also maybe because you said, you made a comment, I did not want to be seen as a professional Christian or something like that. In that,
Yes.
was that also maybe then an inner struggle, and that you were trying to resist, and ultimately your conclusion was, this is, Christian Aid is the best fit for what I stand for,
Yes,
or
it's a
how is
good
that going?
question. I mean, yeah, was it in a struggle? I mean, I've never kind of, I don't think I've ever hidden my faith motivation. Um, so I think colleagues who work closely with me in other
Hmm.
organizations knew that was part of who I was and why I worked, uh, in the organizations I worked in. I mean, it did strike me when I left Save the Children, actually, and I told colleagues I was coming to Christian Aid, how many people kind of came out of the woodwork and kind of told me that they had a kind of active Christian faith. So I found that kind of interesting. I think there are a lot of people who do hide it a bit, and it's particularly interesting, I think, in the international development and humanitarian sector because faith has played such an outsized role in inspiring the creation of organizations and motivating individuals to do what they do. Um, so, you can't understand Oxfam's history without understanding the role that the Quakers and the Anglicans in Oxford actually played in its foundation. You can't actually understand the history of Save the Children without knowing about the personal Christian faith of Eglantine Jebb, its founder, and the way actually she went and tapped into funding from both the Pope at the time and the Archbishop of Canterbury to get it off the ground. So, kind of faith is everywhere in the kind of history of our sector, in the history of social reform, of campaigning for justice and rights in Britain and around the world. And yet somehow it's been slightly sidelined, I think, in what people remember and understand of the world today. So yes, there's a bit of amnesia, and I guess one of the things I've been kind of keen to do at Christian Aid is to remind the organization of why Christian Aid was created, who created it, and without being in any way kind of nostalgic or um, trying to kind of hark back to a world that no longer exists, being really clear about the importance of that founding vision to what Christian Aid still is today. It remains, an agency of the British and Irish churches. It continues to work in partnership for people of all faiths and beliefs. Um, and it's a justice organization rooted in that kind of Christian understanding of what it is to be fully human.
And you also worked in Washington D.C., right? Um, if you compare your experiences, then if you look at faith and how it's being addressed and talked about between the UK and the US, yeah, what are your observations there or your experiences?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because of course, in lots of ways, um, they're kind of inverse situations. I mean, it's been said sometimes of Britain that it's a slightly kind of godless society, but not a godless country. That Christian institutions, religious institutions, are kind of stitched into the kind of fabric of British politics, British public life. Still a country with an established church, with very low levels of public religiosity. Whereas America, a country of, I suppose, in lots of respects, a kind of religious freedom. I mean, certainly a country that always has a kind of free market in religion. That you have much more visible expressions of Christianity in daily life. I mean, I suppose the other kind of big difference, perhaps, is that uh, religion has often been, both a very powerful force for social reform in American history. I mean, you have to only think of the civil rights movement, but also has been a source of great polarization and continues to be to this day. You look at the ways in which religion often gets weaponized in the public square, and you can see that happening with the Trump administration. Um, so religion is a very potent force in America, both for good and for ill, um, and that's I think that's kind of that difference is quite striking from Britain, where I would say on the whole it's more in the background, and perhaps kind of intrudes less obviously on daily life.
Yeah. And did you notice then maybe a change within yourself that, you know, more easily you would say that, I'm a Christian in a US context in comparison
Yeah, I
of
think
the
I think
UK?
perhaps there is something about that. I mean, it's and I suppose I travel a lot. Obviously, I travel a lot with my work, and I've down the years spent a lot of time in Africa, and a lot of time in South Asia in particular. These are parts of the world where people are much less inhibited. They kind of wear their religious identity much more naturally. So I suppose I'm very aware of the very culturally specific way that people express or don't express religious faith in Britain. And I think spending time in other societies, other settings, um, where it's much more natural to kind of talk about these things, kind of wear that identity a bit more openly, probably has kind of slightly changed how I talk about my own religious faith. I think I'm probably still very British about it. It probably feels like quite a kind of private thing in lots of ways. Um, I think the other interesting thing, actually, and I think this is one of the kind of benefits for British society of the growing number of Muslims in Britain. So, a lot of Muslim friends and colleagues I've worked with in the sector who have been much more kind of comfortable, and not in a showy way, not in a conspicuous way, but much more comfortable just about kind of talking about their active faith, um, and it's almost kind of implicitly given permission, I think, to Christians in Britain to do the same.
Mm.
Um, yeah, I think sometimes the very natural and effective way that people from other religions and maybe other parts of the world kind of express their kind of deeper beliefs, um, uh, is a benefit to people in Britain who perhaps been a bit more squeamish about
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
talking about
Yeah.
their own beliefs.
Yeah. No, I also think that there is a change going on in that
Mm.
regard, and maybe we come back to that a little bit later when we talk about sustainable development goals and system
Yeah.
changes, and then how that is linked with maybe inner development. I would like to ask you, and what drives you personally in this work, and you touched upon that a little bit, and I'm asking this question with I mean, and you know this, I think, is that this podcast is a spin-off of a 100-mile walk that I've been doing since 2012. And, I try to raise awareness and funds for poverty, hunger, and injustice. Um, and, you know, if you think about what's going on in the world, and I know especially in Christian age, you talk a lot about climate, debt, inequality. What keeps you walking the extra mile, even when maybe progress feels slow or uncertain, or your knees hurt, like I had last week when one day I had to walk my 20 miles of the 100-mile
Yeah,
campaign. So what keeps you going?
sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, like you, I'm a walker, so I do I kind of do I do know literally what it is to walk the extra mile as well as to do it figuratively. Um, and I've probably been kind of blessed with a reasonable amount of physical resilience and an appetite for kind of for work. Probably got that from my parents, the kind of home setting. So I think that helps. But at a more fundamental level, um, I find that the time I spend with both affected communities in the global south with whom Christian Aid works and partner organizations, and the time I spend with Christian Aid supporters who give and take campaign action and pray for our work, is a very powerful motivator. Um, so, I've got a very privileged role, really. I spend time with remarkable people who, in different ways, um, uh, are committed to a social purpose that takes them beyond themselves. And, I've spent time with some very courageous and creative people who've taken real personal risks to try and kind of make the world a better place. So that gives me a lot of energy, a lot of motivation. I think my own efforts feel quite paltry in comparison with many of the people I meet. Um, but at the same time, definitely energizes me. Um, I guess the other thing probably is prayer. So I think prayer, so aside from anything else, gives you a perspective on the world and hopefully a perspective on yourself. It takes you out of yourself a little bit. And I think, the very simple act of praying um, for God's strength, thanking God for the blessings you've received, um, praying that you will use the gifts you've been given well in the service of others. Um, just mentally, emotionally, I think is very anchoring and very important to me. Um, so I think that helps a lot. And then I think kind of just relationships, family and friends, people who I've kind of got to know through life. Some of those people have been really important in motivating me.
Yeah.
And I suppose that in many ways, um, the you know the, a lot of the people who I've been uh, who've had the most impact on me have been people who've led, I suppose, very kind of purpose led lives, um, and have wanted to live out their lives in service for other people. And I think that's given me quite a lot of quite a lot of desire to, as you say, walk that extra mile.
I, I would like to piggyback on the prayer part. And do you need to do that then in a church setting, or doesn't it matter?
I don't think you have to do it in a church setting. I suppose Christian faith. I mean, there are some quite significant differences between different Christian traditions about the relationship of the personal to the collective. and the extent to which faith is an individual um, act or expression, and the extent to which it's a collective expression. I mean, I think it's both. So I think the we um, is as important in the Christian journey as the I.
Mm.
We only exist in relationship to each other and in relationship to God and God's creation. So that kind of collective dimension to prayer and the expression of Christian faith is really important. But of course, prayer is also an individual act. Um, and I'm a practicing Catholic, so I have I suppose an attachment to kind of sacramental
Mhm.
life, which play out differently for some friends who come from a kind of Protestant tradition. Um, but individual prayer is also, very important in reading scripture, so I would say it's both and, not either or.
Okay. You've spoken a lot actually about the necessity or the need for broad collaboration across churches, faith, and beyond. When you look at younger generations, do you see a shift in how they relate to faith, justice, and collective action? And related with that, what might that mean for Christian aid going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're living in a really interesting time, and I think we're living in a time where, at least in Western Europe and to an extent in North America too, but certainly in Western Europe, I think kind of cultural Christianity in the way that has been historically understood is dying. So kind of Christian faith is a kind of default cultural expression that everybody kind of in a society kind of follows, I think is withering away. Institutional affiliation is weakening in lots of areas of life. People don't identify with institutional churches in the same way I think that they used to. But at the same time, that kind of disaffiliation has opened up new spaces. I think it's opened up a kind of a curiosity and sometimes a kind of spiritual hunger in people, a desire for meaning and connection. Um, and in many ways, people in the West now no longer have the kind of baggage of kind of cultural Christianity, and therefore that can create a kind of an openness, a kind of fresh perspective on on Christianity and on kind of the big religious and philosophical questions more generally. So I think it's more fluid than it used to be, but I don't think, anthropologically speaking, I don't think human beings are any less religious than they've ever been. I think human beings always have the need, as I say, for meaning, for connection, for symbolic language, for a sense of the transcendent. I think that's still there. I think that's hardwired into human beings. Um, I think the challenge for an organization like Christian Aid, or any organization that's kind of organized around a kind of formal faith community,
Mhm.
is how to kind of navigate that world where a lot of people might be quite kind of sympathetic, but aren't necessarily immediately reached through kind of traditional institutional church channels. Um, so there's a kind of trick in how we kind of get to meet people where they are rather than where people were 40, 50, 60 years ago. Um, and how we kind of tap into kind of new forms of energy, new forms of life within the Christian tradition. Um, the church landscape in Britain has completely changed. Um, it's far more ethnically diverse, in many ways more denominationally diverse than it's ever been. Um, Interestingly, a very disproportionate number of active Christians in Britain are living in and around London, partly because of the impact of immigration. So the most religiously active part of Britain is Greater London. Um, so I think we're being kind of challenged all the time to adapt to that kind of shifting landscape. When Christian Aid was created, those differences between the church traditions for many people seemed very real, and were quite sharply defined. And I think now a lot of those divisions between denominations seem like kind of historical curiosities. Um, and particularly when it comes to the work of an organization like Christian Aid, that kind of, I suppose, practical kind of work of the kind of the kind of social gospel. Um, uh, the distinctions but between the denominations perhaps kind of recede into the background a bit. So yeah, I think we're in a different season. At the same time, on many metrics, the world is becoming more religious rather than less. The vast majority of people in the countries where Christian Aid works have an active religious faith. It's one of the organizing principles of daily life. So how do we kind of tap into the enormous power that has, the enormous potential it has as a force for good, while recognizing some of the risks as well? And institutional religion has in different ways hurt a lot of people, failed a lot of people, continues to do so, and that also has to be recognized. So, uh, the role of the church has not been an unalloyed good, is not an unalloyed good, but I think there's a huge amount of positive benefit for the world at large in the kind of partnerships that Christian Aid has been able to forge with church actors on the issues on which we work.
And I imagine, Patrick, that this has also implications then in how you run your organization, how you run, Christian Aid, because as a result of localization, maybe your staff is also much more diverse than it has ever been. Not the center is not necessarily in the UK as a result, because you have all kinds of folks with all kinds of different backgrounds, maybe also with different expectations of what it means to work for a faith-based organization like Christian Aid. You have the whole spectrum probably. So how do you is that correct? My assumption. And if so, how do you navigate it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a tricky question what it means to be a faith-based organization like Christian Aid in a very diverse world. Um, and we have colleagues working in about 15 countries, 15 to 20 countries across Africa and Latin America and Asia and the Middle East, as well as in Britain and in Ireland. And of course, each of those kind of contexts is unique. And, we work in majority Christian settings, and majority Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist settings. We work in settings that are very religiously diverse, some that are very homogeneous. And people have very different understandings of what it often arrive with very different understandings of what it means to work for a Christian organization. I guess we try to keep it as simple as we can and say that, whatever people believe personally, um, everybody needs to align around our four values of love, dignity, equality, and justice. And love is the kind of cornerstone value. And that really it should drive everything that we do. I mean, fundamentally, Christian Aid is a kind of answer to the question, asked of Jesus, who is my neighbor? So those four values are really key, I think, to kind of cohering the organization. I think it's really important that colleagues understand that we work with and for people of all faiths and beliefs, and we don't do that as a kind of reluctant concession to global humanitarian principles or secular nostrums. We do that because we're Christian, and that actually we believe that our work should be an expression of unconditional love for fellow human beings, and that every human being has an innate dignity that should be upheld by the work that we do. So I think that kind of, the radical inclusivity, that is in a way, at the heart of the gospel message, I think really should run as a thread through our work. And then, as I said before, I think there's something about the fact that we were founded by a variety of different churches. The Church of England is our biggest sponsoring church, but we've got Pentecostal churches, the Quakers, some of the Orthodox churches. Um, we have the Reformed churches, the Church of Scotland, for example, churches from the Calvinist tradition. All of these churches are part of the life of Christian Aid. And I think that underscores the importance, as I said, of kind of dialogue, of holding difference well, and of working in partnership. And I think that kind of partnership way of working is kind of hardwired into Christian Aid. We've always been a partner-based organization. I think it partly stems from an understanding that, particularly the churches and other faith actors, uh, are present in communities before, during, and after humanitarian response. They're there for the long term. They're owned by communities. And anything we do should only be a complement to and an amplification of what's already happening at the community level. We're not going in to fix people's problems for them. We're going in to strengthen their arm in fixing their own problems. And I think that's quite rooted in that kind of ecumenical identity that we have, that interchurch identity. So I think that's where we try to kind of center our Christian identity. I think there's always a tension. There'll always be some colleagues who feel that we're too Christian or not Christian enough or Christian in the wrong way.
Mhm.
Um, uh, but on the whole, I'm kind of encouraged by the fact that, many colleagues, particularly colleagues who aren't Christian, feel really positive about Christian Aid's mission and vision. Um, I was at a meeting with Asian colleagues in Sri Lanka a couple of months ago. The majority of people in that room were Muslim or Hindu or Buddhist, but they were very positive about what it is we're trying to do together as Christian Aid, and very comfortable with our faith expression.
Mm. I would like to piggyback further on some of the words that you used. I mean, partnership, for example. And I also have heard you speak a lot about the importance of locally led development and even stepping back as an organization. What does it really take for organizations and maybe for individuals to genuinely let go of power in that way?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's much easier to say it than to do it, and I certainly don't think we've got it all right as Christian Aid. I think there's more that we can do, we should do in this area. But what we have been trying over the last couple of years to effect as we change our organizational model is to um, create more space for partners to work directly with communities on uh, the issues that really drive poverty and exclusion. And for Christian Aid to come in really where we add value. rather than to substitute for somebody else. So we're talking about Christian Aid really playing three main roles: being a convener, helping to bring together others, often unusual partnerships in a single space, um, for conversations that otherwise wouldn't happen. We're talking about Christian Aid being a connector, so particularly linking the local to the global, but also creating horizontal connections between civil society and affected communities in different parts of the world. So, some of the work, for example, we've done on climate justice, linking, communities in Central America and communities in South Asia affected by the climate crisis. And then I think our third role is that of being a catalyst, of helping, often with relatively small sums of flexible funding that we are lucky to have as Christian Aid because of the generosity of our supporters in Britain, using that catalytic funding to um, spark new ways of working, um, new program interventions, campaigns, new networks and coalitions um, that involve some risk, often um, answer the need for a kind of public good, perhaps within the civil society kind of landscape, and then to scale that. And I think, Christian Aid has often been at its best when it's kind of played that catalytic role. In Britain, with Oxfam, we helped to establish the Disasters Emergency Committee, the Fair Trade Foundation. We've done a lot in the climate justice space, the Pan-Africa Climate Justice Alliance. Packager would be an example. Some of the work we've done in South Asia around Dalit and Adivasi rights. I think these would all be good examples of how we've played a kind of catalytic role. So that role of kind of convener, connector, catalyst, I think is where we really add value. But understanding that we're doing that in support of change that's already being pursued by affected communities around the world, and wanting to ensure that as much as possible we're complementing what's already going on the ground. I think in having a kind of adopting a new organizational model and a kind of smaller model, we freed up a significant amount of extra funding that we can invest flexibly in impact work with partners. So we've been able this year to increase by 40% our flexible funding for partners. We've done that because of costs we've taken out of our own structure. And that's been tough. It's been a very tough thing to do. It's been very tough for colleagues who've no longer working with Christian Aid because of changes to our structure. But I think it was the right thing to do. I think we needed to kind of right size the organization, not just financially, because I think we were spending a disproportionate amount of our resource on ourselves. But I think we also needed to right size the organization mentally, so we weren't behaving as though we were the center of the universe. And I think kind of getting us to kind of understand that we are one node in a civil society ecosystem rather than the hub, I think is was a kind of important shift.
Hmm. No, thanks for the three coming up with the three C's there. Well, easy to remember. Convener, connector, and catalyst. I would like to piggyback on connector because I also hope that this podcast is somehow contributing to connecting people. And then I hope, one of the things that I've stolen from a philosopher I like, Ken Wilber, is nobody can be wrong 100% of the time, or everybody's perspective is true, albeit partial. So I hope that the listeners to this podcast realize, hey, I might not always agree with the guests, but there is something. If I listen carefully, there is something where I can connect, and then maybe we can start a conversation. I've tried to weave that also into the questions. So I'm going to connect you with the previous guest, and the previous guest is a question for you.
My question for the next guest, and I won't say this absolutely correctly, but is how can we get patriarchal religious organizations to recognize that patriarchy does not work. That there needs to be equality in power and authority and keys in religious organizations. And how can we bring about that change? What are the steps that we can take to help bring about that change?
I don't know if you were able to listen to that particular uh, podcast. No, I should not influence your answer. I can tell you later about that. So
Yeah, but so just a small, simple question to answer. Yeah, and I don't know that I have the answer, but I have a couple of reflections on the question. So I think part of the approach is to encourage people to draw on the resources within their own tradition, within their own culture or society, rather than to kind of look somewhere else for the answer. And if I reflect on the work that Christian Aid has done as part of the side-by-side movement, and you know about that. So working initially in the early phases with churches and church-based institutions, but latterly also with Islamic organizations to tackle primarily gender-based violence, but doing it in a way that encourages people to draw on their own religious traditions to find um, the reasons why gender-based violence is uh, contrary to religious teaching, religious law is ethically wrong. And I think that's been very effective. So working with Christian communities on using the Old and New Testaments, the Christian Bible, with Muslim communities using the Quran and the other Islamic writings and teachings. Um, uh, I think approaching it in that way, you have deeper conversations and you achieve more durable shifts in people's perspectives. So I think that's one really important principle. I think the other perhaps really important principle is to kind of sit down with people with whom you disagree and to seek out the common ground. And often you don't need to agree on everything to progress. So, one of the pieces of work a partner of ours has done in Colombia, it's an organization called Colombia Diversa. It works with sexual minorities, LGBT people who have been particularly victimized during the Colombian Civil War. And as part of the kind of Colombian peace process, they have been engaging in dialogue with Pentecostal and evangelical churches that are often very conservative on questions of sexual morality and questions of sexuality, but trying to kind of forge common ground around stemming violence against LGBT people, and essentially saying, whatever your beliefs about sexuality or about gender or about uh, you know sex outside of the context of marriage, can we forge common ground on the principle that there should be non-violence towards other people, fellow human beings? Can we forge common ground on a kind of principle of kind of mutual respect and human dignity? And I think that kind of dialogue has been quite powerful. So I think there's something about sitting down with, engaging with people who hold differing views to you, not simply in order to get them to change their mind, being open to having your mind changed as well, not trying to get agreement on everything, but trying to get agreement on some fundamentals about how we uphold the dignity of each other feels to me like the way forward. Obviously, if you look at the history of the churches, in many ways, the churches have and continue to reinforce and perpetuate um, gender roles that marginalize and diminish women and girls. And that needs challenging, but it needs challenging from within and in the right ways if it's to kind of lead to to positive change. And I think in a way, if the churches have in many cases been part of the problem, then they also have to be part of the solution, or they will continue to be part of the problem. So there's something there that I think needs needs to be acted on. But yes, I think the churches, like every human institution, they kind of reflect human failings as well as the kind of the great human achievements and accomplishments.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. No, thanks, Patrick. And I would really encourage the listeners, if they did not listen to the previous episode with Susie Greco, who was tells about how she has been, sexually abused as a child, as a young adult, later as well, and found very little to no support from the church, where she's still part of. So that's kind of where the question comes from as well. Your question for the next guest.
Well, perhaps my question for the next guest, which is a little bit linked to the conversation we've just been having, is where have you had your mind changed on an issue, and why?
Okay. I like that. Let me throw in my favorite question, which most guests find very difficult. But music is very important to me, and so I always have a question about music as well. If I ask you to come up with a song or a piece of music that, for a big part, represents what you are about, who you are, which song or piece of music would that be, and why?
Gosh, I mean, that's a really tough one. And it's funny actually, because I kind of bought a lot of music. I bought a lot of CDs, but probably until my kind of early 30s, and then stopped collecting music. And I've only recently actually got around to sorting out a Spotify account, and both started to kind of reacquaint myself with a lot of the music I used to listen to, but also listening to new music as well. So that's been a kind of great a great pleasure. I mean, there's lots of there's lots of church music that kind of resonates for me, because I guess I sing hymns in church, and I enjoy I enjoy kind of particularly, I suppose, English kind of hymnody. And I had a Welsh grandfather who was a chorister, and a great lover of kind of choral music, and so that had an influence on me. But I mean, I was thinking, maybe a couple of songs. I mean, if I'm allowed to break the rules, I mean, uh, I love Kate Rusby, who I think has a fantastic voice, and there's a very beautiful version of "Fare Thee Well" that she sings with pipe and drums in the background, which and it's a very elegiac song, but it's also a hopeful song. And then, although I think I probably prefer the music to the man. I'm kind of suddenly a fan of Van Morrison's music and "Precious Time" by Van Morrison, um, which I think kind of says something about the importance of using the finite time and the gifts that we've been given while we're around. Um, you know, well, using it well, uh, and I like the kind of blues kind of style of Van Morrison, and so yes, maybe those two songs,
Okay.
"Fare Thee Well" and "Precious Time."
Okay. And I will add them to a playlist on Spotify that we developed. You go to
Fantastic.
Spotify and you look for hashtag Walk Talk
Mm.
Listen. You will find all the songs that have been picked by the guests so far. So thanks for that, Patrick. The conversations always go so fast. There are a couple of questions that I'd like to touch upon with you quickly, though, before we call it a day. Especially recently in an interview, um, you said that climate change is fundamentally reshaping the nature of poverty. What worries you most about where this is heading?
I suppose um, I mean, what worries me, I suppose, is that we're destroying our own home, and you can take you know, people will have different views on um, precisely how quickly um, the impacts of the climate crisis are going to reshape our world, and kind of how cataclysmic the effects may be. But the effects, is already clear, are very profound. I mean, I travel, to um, see work in countries like Malawi, Bangladesh, Central America, and see it firsthand the impacts of climate change. And you talk to smallholder farmers who they don't have the language of climate change, but you ask them about what's happening to rainfall, what's happening to their ability to grow their crops, what's happening to floods and storms. And they're very clear about the increasing intensity and unpredictability of what's happening to them. And people being forced from their homes, people losing their livelihoods. So this is, has an incredible destructive potential. And I think we have a deep responsibility to do everything we can to minimize climate change and to help people to adapt to it and to compensate people who suffered irreversible losses from it. And I worry that we treat it simply as a technical challenge and lose sight of the fact that at root there is a kind of ethical challenge about how we relate to each other and to creation of which we're a part. And I think unless we recognize that it's a spiritual and an ethical challenge as much as a scientific and technical challenge, we will fail, yeah, to meet it effectively. Um, so I think that's the kind of that's the shift that's needed.
Yeah.
And and if we don't meet that challenge adequately, then I think much of the important work that has been done in recent decades to improve people's standards of living will be eroded and potentially even reversed um, because of the climate crisis.
Do you still see hope though? And if so, where?
Yeah, I know, and I absolutely do, and I think from a Christian perspective, hope's a virtue. Virtues have to be practiced, so it's not kind of it's not wishful thinking. It's not a mental state. It's it's an active stance, and I see hope in the work that privileged to be a small part of Christian Aid, the work of our partners of affected communities. I see it out there in the wider world, in lots of practical ways in which people are seeking to make a positive difference in their own lives, in their communities, for their neighbours, and we shouldn't underestimate the power that comes from committed people who care for each other, care for the world, getting organised and doing stuff to make a positive difference. I think that's incredibly powerful. So I think despair's a luxury, and it's an unaffordable luxury for most people in the world. So let's not indulge in despair.
Okay. I think you are really, you look at systems, right, and processes that need to change to make this world better. But I also see, when I listen to you, that you are very cognizant is that there needs to be a connection with inner development as well. And what I'm trying to get at is, I think we have decided as a world, and it's not perfect, that we need to make this world more sustainable and just. And we came up with 17 sustainable development goals, maybe too many. But at least we kind of agreed, and we had a better process than before with the Millennium Development Goals. However, we are getting closer to 2030, and we are not reaching those 17 sustainable development goals. We are only at 15 to 70% at average, and maybe, the last year or so, it's getting even worse on many, in many areas. Now, this growing group of people have said, one of the reasons that we don't make the progress that we need to make is because we did not pay attention to the abilities, skills, and knowledge that you need as an individual as well as a community. And as a result of a survey, they came up with 5 inner development goals that we need to work on: being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. And then they identified 25 skills, among others, the hope that you mentioned, and said that's a virtue, right? It's an action, and you need to work on that. And funnily enough, hope is one of the skills under the inner development goals, acting. So things like empathy, critical thinking are necessary. My question to you is, have you heard about the inner development goals? That's one. And then second, either you have or you have not, any thoughts, especially in relation to the role of faith-based organizations and faith actors?
Yeah, so I have heard of the inner development goals, and I have kind of looked at them. And of course, there's going to be a really important discussion and set of decisions to take in the near future about what, if anything, replaces the sustainable development goals when we reach the year 2030. And you can debate whether there are too many SDGs and whether they're the right ones, and you can debate whether the inner development goals are exactly right. But I think there's a core insight that needs to be banked that's really important, which is that human flourishing is about being more and not just about having more. And in fact, often having more can become a barrier to being more, particularly if you've already got enough to meet your basic needs. So understanding development, if we want to call it that, is not just a kind of process of acquisition and accumulation. Understanding that human flourishing happens where we are part of a society of rights and obligations. We look out for each other, where there's decent work, there's active citizenship, there are responsive and accountable states, but also people are able to grow ethically and spiritually, I think is really important. And I think the churches and faith institutions are really important actors in this conversation because they both make a very practical difference to many billions of people in terms of health and education and social support. But they also, at a deeper level, give people that sense of meaning and connection and community, which actually is what kind of ultimately makes us fully human. So I think they can kind of bridge the world of the SDGs and the inner development goals in a way that perhaps not many other institutions can. I think they're very important to both agendas, but the trick is, I think, to kind of marry up um, those two dimensions of human flourishing. The material dimension, which does matter, particularly matters if you're hungry, if you don't have shelter, if you don't have um, critical health care or education for your children, but marrying that up with that inner life, which also has a kind of very important kind of outer manifestation, but that inner life of, as I say, kind of meaning, connection, belonging, um, that is offered by the world's religious traditions. So yes, there's a kind of that I suppose begs the question as to who's around the table as we have this conversation about what comes after 2030, what comes after the SDGs. It's a conversation we're starting to have inside Christian Aid. I'm sure it's happening in lots of other organizations too.
Yeah, and I've maybe coming back to what I've heard you say in terms of stepping back, and maybe this is my last question. What does stepping back feel like as a leader?
And stepping back from
Because I think if I look at what you're trying to do with Christian Aid
yeah,
is, you know, looking at localization, you
yes,
know, um, yeah, I've talked within JLI often about an
yeah,
octopus, right?
yeah,
And where you're in
mm,
you're all um, connected, but the arms can function by itself. I mean,
yeah,
but are part of the octopus. So
yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, I think stepping back can feel it can feel kind of both a bit exciting and a bit alarming. I think excitement and fear have the same kind of physiological kind of root in the body, in the human body. Um, but I think it can also be very liberating because I think by stepping back, you're forced to really focus on where you add value as an organization or as an individual. Um, and it gives you the opportunity to discover what's already out there in the world, what's already going on, and where you can add. Um, so one of the kind of principles of the new organizational model that we've adopted in Christian Aid is collaboration and abundance over scarcity and control. So organizations tend to focus on what's within their direct control and command. And of course, there's never enough resource to do everything that they want to do. But if you kind of flip that and you say, well, the only constraint is our ability or willingness to collaborate. And out there in the wider world, there is almost infinite agency and creativity and resource. Um, then suddenly huge possibilities are opened up. Um, and that, I hope, is what we will kind of see happen in Christian Aid as we kind of adopt this, simpler, kind of humbler organizational posture. that we will be kind of struck by the new opportunities that exist to make a difference in the world by working alongside others, and we will be able to be bolder as a result. So I think maybe stepping back ultimately enables you to take quite a big step forward.
Okay. Patrick, I would like to thank you for today's conversation. But before we really end, is there a question that I did not ask you today that I should have asked you?
I don't think so. No. No, it's been great having this conversation. I've enjoyed your questions, even if I've been a bit challenged by some of them.
I think you did a marvelous job.
And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, some other points I need to talk to you about your walking and find out a bit more about where you've been walking from and to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great. No, and I did, the listeners know, I did walk last Monday in New York for 20 miles. And I used to walk myself 100 mile in 5 days, but we have changed it now. So for
yeah,
JLI, we have said we will walk 1 year, and we asked the JLI community to contribute miles. So I contributed
yes,
20 miles.
yeah,
And it started 3 weeks ago in Pakistan, where my
mm,
colleague Noor also walked 20 miles. He did it in 2 days. And we have somebody that actually last week's guest will walk in Boston. And so we have people in
yeah,
Singapore, um, Kenya. So because I think we don't need one person to walk. We need to walk as a collective. And that's
mm,
more
mm,
important than ever. So that's kind of the
yeah, yeah.
message that we're trying to give for this year. But thank you so much for today's conversation, Patrick. I really enjoyed it. I could talk another hour with you. Thank you for what you do, who you are. And yeah, we will be, closely looking at Christian Aid, where, we'll further go. And yeah, I have a lot of admiration for all the work that you are doing, but also the rest of your organization. So thanks you for that.
Right, thanks for the opportunity.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.